Lady Jane Grey, who has perhaps unfairly been called England's forgotten queen, sat on the throne for just 9 days in October of 1553 before she was forced to abdicate. Although her time on the throne was brief, it did not make her any less a queen than Elizabeth I or Henry VIII, and yet history almost completely erased her name from its pages. So why should we remember her today? What happened to her after she stepped down, and why does her story still matter? Welcome back to the series. Today we are going to talk about Lady Jane Grey, who has perhaps unfairly been called England's forgotten queen. She is indeed an easily forgotten monarch, but she was queen nonetheless. Let me explain. In 1553, Mary Tudor was nearing the end of her 5-year reign, and because she had no surviving children, there was a question as to who would succeed her. The obvious answer was her half-sister, Princess Elizabeth. But Mary never really got along with Elizabeth, and it seemed as though she might name someone else as her heir. This caused great concern among Elizabeth's supporters, since Mary was known to be vindictive, and Elizabeth was rumored to have had a hand in the death of their father, King Henry VIII. Afraid that Mary might put Elizabeth to death once she was gone, Elizabeth's supporters hatched a plan to place another, more pliable monarch on the throne instead. This person was none other than Lady Jane Grey, a 16-year-old girl whom Henry had made his granddaughter and heir, presumptive meaning that she would become heir to the throne if Mary died before her, but only if Mary had no children, which ended up not being the case. However, because Jane was Protestant, whereas Mary was Catholic, Jane's family saw this as a golden opportunity to turn back the clock and restore Protestantism as the official religion of England. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, went to Mary and told her that he was afraid that the country would erupt in rebellion if she left the throne to Elizabeth. He told her that instead, they should place the young Jane on the throne until Elizabeth was married. Then Jane could step down and marry someone of Mary's choosing. Mary, who may or may not have been completely of sound mind, agreed to do this, likely because she thought that she could control Jane and use her as a puppet. But once Jane was on the throne, the plan fell apart immediately. Jane didn't want to be a puppet. She wanted to rule in her own right. Additionally, while Mary may have been willing to step back for a time, she never intended to let Elizabeth take the throne. As soon as Jane stepped aside, Mary would become queen again. Of course, this meant that Jane's family would have to ensure that she stayed out of Mary's clutches. Her father took her to his home, where he hoped to hide her away until Mary was dead. But this also meant that Jane was separated from her husband, Guilford Dudley, whom Mary had given permission to marry, but only if she became queen. Jane would later write to him, "My heart is so sore at this unseasonable parting that I cannot show my face to the water for the continual flowing of tears." But these tears were not enough to move public opinion. People believed that Jane had betrayed Mary, and so she was called the 9 Days Queen. As for Mary, she was furious that her cousin dared to sit on the throne that was rightfully hers. When her uncle, the Earl of Sussex, arrived to escort Jane back to court, he found her weeping uncontrollably. According to Sussex, when he told her that she must go back to London, she asked, "Is there no other way? I shall die in London," referring to the fact that she believed Mary would kill her. Mary did not intend to kill her, at least not at first. She wanted to punish her, yes, but she would have preferred to keep Jane alive as a warning to others who might oppose her. She imprisoned Jane in the Tower of London, ostensibly for treason, but also for usurping Mary's throne. However, she kept her there under the guise of protecting her and allowed her parents to visit her regularly. After spending 3 months in the Tower, Jane was moved to a house in the country belonging to her father. But this was just a ruse. A few days later, Mary's council met and decided to bring charges against Jane. The indictment listed 18 counts of high treason, most of which centered around the claim that Jane had wanted to be queen and had pretended to be willing to step down only to keep people from finding out that she had no intention of giving up the throne. Now, although Jane was only 17 years old, she was tried as an adult, likely because the government wanted to make an example of her. It also helped that Jane's trial was very public. Eyewitnesses reported that she behaved calmly and collectedly throughout the proceedings, even though she later said that she felt as though she might faint. After hearing the charges against her, Jane responded by saying, "I am ready to answer all things." Each night she was visited by her mother, who gave her spiritual comfort and tried to persuade her that God still had plans for her. Ultimately, Jane pleaded guilty to all 18 counts, perhaps in the hopes that this would convince Mary to go easy on her. But Mary wasn't interested in showing her any mercy. One of her advisors wrote, "The Queen is very resolute in this business and will have judgment to pass against the lady without any hope of pardon." In the end, Jane was sentenced to death. On February 12, 1554, she was led into the court. She wore a black gown over her head, a white linen cap. Her hands were bound behind her back, and she leaned heavily on one of her ladies in waiting. At some point during the procession, she stopped, removed her veil, and held it aloft so that everyone could see her face. Some onlookers fainted at the sight, but most stood and stared as she walked past them. Jane was taken to the place of execution, where she knelt down beside a velvet cushion. Here, according to reports, she prayed on her knees for a full 15 minutes. When she was ready to die, she lay down on the velvet cushion and laid her head on the chopping block. The executioner approached, but she stopped him with her finger and asked him to pull up her nightgown so that she could expose her neck. He obliged, and then placed the red-hot axe on her neck and cut off her head. Reportedly, Jane's head was cut off so cleanly that her neck was whole. Her body was sewn up in a leaden coffin and buried in the Grey family vault in the Church of St. Mary, alongside her father and her grandparents, Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Now, as for why we should care about Jane's story today, I think it comes down to a couple of points. First, Jane is a good example of how women in the 16th century were treated as pawns in games of power. Men like her father and Mary's advisors saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used in achieving their goals. They sacrificed her happiness, her dignity, and ultimately her life without a second thought. Second, Jane is a good example of what happens when you defy the monarchy. Even though Jane was technically acting on her father's orders and doing what she believed to be in the best interest of her country, she was still seen as a traitor when Mary reclaimed the throne. Because of this, she was thrown in prison and eventually killed. Finally, I think Jane's story is worth telling because it reminds us that even those with great power can be forgotten over time. When Mary returned to power, she ensured that Jane's story would be erased from the historical record, or at least that was her intention. But through the efforts of historians and biographers over the last several hundred years, we have been able to uncover Jane's story and give her the recognition she deserves. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. We have lots of videos about women in history on this channel, as well as a playlist dedicated to strong women of the past. If you want to support the work we do here, you can join our membership program. I'll see you next time.